So Mr. and Ms. Unrath, as well as Ms. Lindsay. Give me just a minute here. So again, I've reviewed some pictures, some notes left on doors, or note left on a door, maybe might be more accurate. Saw some pictures, garbage can, seagull. Before we get started, I do have a couple of questions. And the way these things go on the initial hearings, I'm going to swear both party or all witnesses. I see Miss Lindsay is here with who I assume is Mr. Lindsay, who's referenced in the report at some point, referenced in the declarations here at some point. And it looks like Mr. and Ms. Unrath are here. And so I'm going to swear both parties in. I'll hear from the petitioners. I'll hear from the respondent. Following that, I'll make a determination whether an order is appropriate. But before we start, I do have some questions for the Unraths, and you folks can unmute here. And I guess, again, this is the only case that's actually going to go to hearing here this morning, other than that case we just had. So, you know, I normally lay out some ground rules, and the first one is don't interrupt the other party when one's speaking. I want all comments directed to me. You know, sometimes you're going to hear things you disagree with. You're going to hear things you don't like. But yeah, I'm going to just all comments directed to me and don't interrupt the other party. So who's going to speak for the Unraths first? I just have a question before we get started here.
So I will, Your Honor.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear and affirm the information and testimony you provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
How long, you put your hand down. How long have you lived there?
We've lived here for about 18 months.
Okay. And then were the Gardners, or not the Gardner, Lindsay's, I'm sorry. Ms. Lindsay's living there when you moved in?
We both moved in around the same time. The Lindsay's just a little while after us, I believe.
All right. So this garbage issue, has this been an ongoing thing, or is this like there was this one instance where the seagull got into it and that caused some problems? Did it all start then, or is this an ongoing thing?
It did. It all started then. This has not been an ongoing issue, and certainly not something the Lindsay's have made us aware of. How well have you gotten along with Ms. Lindsay, I guess in particular, but both Lindsays in general prior to this? So this was our first instance in actually meeting Mrs. Lindsay at the time of the first incident on January 30th. Mr. Lindsay, I had met briefly in passing around the time where we all moved in. He and I exchanged contact information around that time, just off the premise of being next door neighbors, that kind of thing. Other than that, we've had very minimal interaction with their family, at least not directly. Now, there have been a couple of instances that I did my best to highlight in the petitioning statement where we were made aware of their presence and behavior in our neighborhood. Most specifically with regard to their windows always being open, hearing a lot of curse words and profanity coming out of the house, trying to keep our children generally away from them. Mrs. Lindsay is something of a known commodity in our neighborhood, which I'll share with you.
Well, no, I'm just asking questions here. I'm going to have some questions here before you don't need to share with that now, but And then how's I can't believe I'm asking this question, but I'll ask it anyway. What's the garbage can situation been since all this kind of came to a head, so to speak? Is this an ongoing issue? It's been resolved?
No, there's no
not, or, go ahead.
There's no issue, Your Honor.
All right.
It was just those two incidents.
So, okay, just I'm going to come back to you. I'm not, your testimony's not done. And so I just want to come to Ms. Lindsay there for a second there. Could you unmute yourself, please, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Could you raise your right hand? You swear and affirm the information and testimony you provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Can you put your hand down, please? So as I read this, again, I didn't know how long you folks have lived there. Any of you folks have lived there. But as I read kind of the situation and, kind of the old expression, kind of making a mountain out of a molehill comes to mind. And I'm kind of talking to you in the sense that, things happen sometimes when garbage cans let out to get picked up. Sometimes they get over full. They do. And sometimes it may be, I live in a neighborhood where sometimes coyotes are present. Sometimes a coyote might get into it and create a bit of a mess in the street. And then, it gets cleaned up. And then, generally people think, oh my gosh, yeah, that's one of those things. And there you go. But it kind of seems to me like you kind of took this to a level where it really didn't need to go. And so I guess I'll have you respond to that. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to swear in the Unraths. I'm going to get all their testimony from them. Then I'll hear from you. And then I'll make a decision as to where to go from here. Keeping in mind, you guys all still need to live next to each other. When you get courts and court orders involved, it seems a bit of a, things just turn into a real mess in a hurry. And so I'll have you respond to my comment. Then I'm going to go back to Mr. Unrath, take his complete testimony. Then I'll hear from you and then Ms. Unrath too, if she wishes to testify. And then you, and then Mr. Lindsay also. But anyway, do you have any comment to what I said about the mountain of the molehill there, ma'am?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I simply started out meeting the Unraths by being very pleasant to them and asking them if they knew about this issue that was going on. And the reason that I went over and asked them was because we had been dealing with garbage blowing into our yard on other occasions. And now, as you can see from photographs of the first time that I ever approached them, the can had been, I think that was the day that the seagulls had gotten into it and there were birds flying all around, and it wasn't going to get any better in the next several hours until the garbage people got there. And I did not feel it was my duty to go out and pick it up and smash the can lid down to keep it contained until then, but I really didn't want it being blown all about and picked all about the neighborhood. So I submitted the ring video that Mr. Unrath had sent to my husband of my very first encounter with them. And I believe that I was very pleasant and asking if they would do something about it, so that, I wrote the note 4 hours after that because it just got worse as the morning went on, as my pictures showed. And I was kind of peeved watching the garbage getting blown into my yard and down the street, and knowing that it could have been contained. That was all. And I never meant for this to get to this point ever, Your Honor. There's never been anything to indicate that this should go before a judge. Simply a neighbor asking another neighbor to contain their garbage, and in line with HOA, with good environmental practices, and with the ordinance of the city. That was all.
All right, Mr. Unrath, you're still under oath. I'll hear from you. What's your, tell me why it is you need an order against Ms. Lindsay.
Yes, Your Honor. So good morning. I do have a statement prepared. So if you'll just bear with me for a few minutes, I'll lay it out for you. So I'd like to open by stating that I initiated this petition under the advice and recommendation of both law enforcement and military legal counsel. when presented with the circumstances that I'll now do my best to relate. So as my petition describes, on the 30th of January, which was trash pickup day at 9:03 a.m., Mrs. Lindsay approached our front door in an agitated state after several birds apparently tore into one of our trash bags, scattering a small amount of trash parcels near our curb. I'd refer you to Exhibit D, which is a photo of the trash can at 9:06 a.m. Not immediately receiving an answer on our Ring doorbell, Mrs. Lindsay became impatient and hammered directly on our front door, stating aloud that she hadn't even seen our children leave for school yet. When my wife, Heather, did respond over the doorbell cam a moment later, Mrs. Lindsay confronted her over her grievance as Heather prepared for work, stating that we needed to address her complaint. I refer you to Exhibit A, the doorbell cam photo and transcript of the confrontation. This, I would note, was the first personal interaction either Heather or I had had with Mrs. Lindsay in roughly 18 months of living next to her. In this encounter, Heather was kind, apologetic, and expressed every intention to address the issue after her work obligation. Unsatisfied, Mrs. Lindsay returned roughly 2 hours later at 11:12 a.m. with an outrageously hateful, accusatory, and insult-laced 2-page letter, which she angrily affixed to our door, muttering that there was no excuse for our perceived inaction despite us not being home. I'd refer you to Exhibit B, doorbell cam photo, and the transcript of the letter drop-off, as well as Exhibit C, the letter itself. The letter, which included profanity, also threatened to involve our HOA, which Mrs. Lindsay implied she would take pleasure in doing. My wife was completely shocked by this sudden and dramatic escalation upon reading the letter after returning home over lunch. Fearful of what Mrs. Lindsay might do next and concerned about a confrontation outside, Heather immediately called me at work. I acknowledge that in circumstances like this, often the best course of action is de-escalation between parties, which is exactly what I attempted once Heather informed me of Mrs. Lindsay's behavior. After overcoming my own surprise at her actions and returning home to pick up the debris left by the birds, I reached out to her husband, Kendall, and arranged for a phone call during lunch to cool temperatures. During that conversation, which I would describe as very amicable, Mr. Lindsay acknowledged our concerns, stated that he disagreed with his wife's methods, and expressed regret that Heather, my wife, felt fearful of Mrs. Lindsay. We came to the agreement that Mrs. Lindsay would no longer approach our home and attempt to contact us, and that he and I would broker any further issues between our families. Our family, however, was shaken and concerned by her overreaction in this instance. I had thought the issue resolved, but our arrangement hardly lasted 48 hours before Mrs. Lindsay attempted to call me directly at work on the 1st of February using a number I had never provided her. I did not answer that call. I'd refer you to Exhibit E, which is a phone log of my call with Mr. Lindsay and Mrs. Lindsay's attempted contact. The next series of incidences began on the 13th of February at 11:03 a.m., again on our trash pickup day. Once again, Mrs. Lindsay became irate and angered over our trash can, specifically that my family's trash can lid had been blown open by 13-mile-per-hour winds after we had all departed for work and school. Acting against our pre-existing arrangement for no contact, Mrs. Lindsay once more approached our front door and attempted to confront anyone available at our home regarding her grievance. When she did not receive an answer, she proceeded to gather pieces of trash blown in from the neighborhood park across the street and elsewhere and deposited them on our front lawn and porch. I'd refer you to Exhibit F, the doorbell cam photo, and the trash planting activities. She is shown here in clear view holding this litter. I would also like to refer to the respondent's Exhibit I.
Hang on just a second,
Yep.
Mr. Unrath. Ms. Lindsay, you need to stop that. You know, people can
Sorry, Your
testify all
Honor.
kinds of things. I'm watching what you're doing and you're not helping yourself by doing that. So I'm going to give you a chance to speak when the time comes, but you just need to stop what you're doing. You understand? Apologize for the interruption, Mr. Unrath. You can continue.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'd also like to refer you to the respondent's Exhibit I, where Mrs. Lindsay admits to planting other litter, which includes imagery of the trash parcel she later weighed down with rocks on our lawn. The trash parcel in frame is Kirkland's brand, which is notable as our family does not have a Costco membership. It was evident Mrs. Lindsay did not pause to consider any other possible source for these parcels before attributing them to us and planting them across our property. At 11:08 a.m. that morning, Mrs. Lindsay then began harassing me with text messages at work, demanding that I address her grievances with our trash can. I'd refer you to Exhibit G, Jean Lindsay text messages. Despite asking Mrs. Lindsay to stop contacting me, making it clear that we wanted no contact with her, and reiterating that she was frightening our family, she persisted until I was forced to block her messages. Her husband, Kendall Lindsay, also began texting me with complaints at the same time, further pulling me away from my duties at Joint Base Lewis McChord. I'd refer you to Exhibit H, Kendall Lindsay text messages. Ultimately, I was forced to block his messages as well, as he clearly had no intention of upholding our previous agreement regarding our safety concerns. During all of this digital harassment, Heather called me and let me know about Jean Lindsay approaching our door once again and her trash planting harassment. It became difficult for my wife and I to concentrate on our workplace obligations as we struggled to deal with the Lindsays for much of that afternoon, causing us significant emotional distress. This all culminated at 6:00 p.m. that night as I returned home from work, and what I now know was a deliberately planned and engineered confrontation in my driveway by Mr. and Mrs. Lindsay. I would like to refer you to the Respondent's Exhibit J, which is the video the Lindsays surreptitiously recorded of their attempt to goad me into some kind of reaction as I tried to unload my car and enter my home. In the video, it is evident the Lindsays have been watching our home, waiting for me to arrive, as Mrs. Lindsay can be heard saying, "He'll be gone, you're taking too long," as Mr. Lindsay inserts a recording device into his pocket. Once outside, you can see Mr. Lindsay cross our property line and hear him solicit me directly. When I noticed him, I stated plainly that there was nothing for us to talk about, thinking that he would leave me alone, and went about my business. When Mr. Lindsay persisted, I informed him that I was considering a restraining order after the events of the day and stated that he had failed to uphold his agreement to keep Mrs. Lindsay away from our home, as my wife had become very fearful of her. Mr. Lindsay then made further comments about our trash can and retreated back to his driveway. At that point, Mrs. Lindsay emerged from the doorway, obviously unsatisfied with the outcome, and they both began shouting and screaming at me from across the lawn about their trash grievances, bringing our other neighbors to their doors to investigate. Once their hostility became blatantly evident, I attempted to de-escalate and disengage, telling Mrs. Lindsay to please go back inside, that I had nothing more to say to either of them, and to have a nice night, all of which can be plainly heard in the footage. Mrs. Lindsay, however, predictably escalated by insulting me with profanity, threatening my employment and stating that she would involve my chain of command, and making bizarre counter-accusations of non-existent threats. Mr. Lindsay, in turn, began advancing towards me during this exchange, again crossing our property line. I can be heard telling him not to approach me. Fortunately, my wife Heather emerged after calling the police and began shouting at them to leave us alone, causing them to eventually depart after throwing more insults. The responding officer from Lacey PD arrived and spoke with my wife and I in our home. He reviewed the text messages, our description of past encounters with the Lindsays, and the events of the day. The officer recommended that I file this petition for an anti-harassment order with the county as soon as possible. Your Honor, nothing about the respondent's grievances, which begin and end with the condition of our trash can, justifies the outrageously harassing behavior Mrs. Lindsay has subjected my family and I to in these instances. Her disproportionate concern and anger over an inconsequential matter that hardly affected her is not an excuse to text, call, leave angry notes, plant litter, confront us at home, hammer on our door, threaten my employment, or otherwise target us. In every instance I have covered this morning, we have been the solicited and targeted party. Never once did my wife or I initiate these encounters. Even now, my wife, children, and I all remain greatly concerned and in emotional distress over Mrs. Lindsay's erratic, aggressive, and unpredictable behavior, and believe our current living conditions to be hostile. My children, who are within earshot of Mrs. Lindsay as she insulted us during her confrontation, frequently worry about going outside and express fear at seeing the Lindsays in their driveway. My 8-year-old daughter has even asked me if we can move. We've had to purchase additional security cameras and equipment for our home to provide our family peace of mind. A day has not gone by that I don't get a rush of adrenaline when I get out of my car in the evenings and when my wife is frightened to go anywhere near a trash can out of worry that Mrs. Lindsay will once again reemerge. I would humbly request that you grant this petition so that our family can serve the remainder of our time at JBLM in peace before we PCS next summer. Thank you.
Ms. Unrath, do you wish to add any testimony? I could swear you in if I'll hear from you, or you can rely on what your husband just said. And again, if your answer is yes, I'll swear you in. I'll hear from you.
Sure.
Raise your right hand, please. You swear and affirm the information you provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You can put your hand down, and then go ahead, ma'am. Anything you wish to add at this time?
I mean, he did a pretty accurate job of explaining kind of the situation. And like I said, we've lived next to them for more than a year for sure. And it has been a constant, I'm hearing her screaming and cursing. The neighborhood kids, including our own, are all scared of her. It's a constant hearing her cursing that's so loud that we can hear it in our house. And it's over various things not having to do with us. And so we've kind of known to just kind of stay away. And then we've heard stuff that I don't want to say because it's not my own testimony.
And that's not really, the language people choose to use, that's not something really. The only thing I can do here, ma'am, is with regard to a no contact order, just enter an order that says, you're not to contact this person. I can't tell her to clean up her language. I can't tell her to, don't speak as loudly as she does or anything like that. The only thing in front of me is no contact and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
So go
no,
ahead. I
absolutely.
apologize for interrupting. You can.
Oh, no,
continue.
that's okay. That's okay. Yeah. I mean, we just want to be left alone. We just want to live in peace and just, we do understand that we live next door. We're not asking for them to move or anything like that. We just want to be able to live peacefully next to each other without being bothered.
Anything further, ma'am?
No.
Okay. And so Ms. Lindsay, I'm going to come to you. You can unmute yourself. And I can't remember if I'm going to have you, just as an abundance of caution, I'm going to swear you in again. Can you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear and affirm the information you provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? You can put your hand down and go ahead. I'll hear from you. And by the way, just there was reference to a video. I did review this file in before I got on the actually over the weekend, and I was, for whatever reason, I wasn't able to view video. I saw something was in there, but I didn't actually see the video. And so we can talk about that in a minute. I'm going to hear, I just want to let everybody, I should have let you know that up front, but I'm going to hear from Ms. Lindsay and Mr. Lindsay if he chooses to testify or not. And Ms. Lindsay, if she chooses to testify, she doesn't have to, she doesn't want. And then we'll proceed from there. But I did see all the written exhibits. I saw the text, saw the note, there's a photograph and all that sort. But for whatever reason, the video didn't come through. And if you paid attention to earlier testimony, that happens sometimes. That's not unique to this case. But Ms. Lindsay, I'll hear from you. What's your position on their request?
I wish that you had been able to see both of those videos that we had submitted, because one was their ring video of me approaching their ring and my first and only interaction with Heather Unrath. And I wanted you to see there was no irateness at all to me, and how pleasant I was introducing myself and letting them know about what was going on.
Okay,
And
I'm
so
going to
that
stop
was-
you there for a second, but I mean, I, again, didn't see the video. I have to say, I did read the letter. Doesn't come across as a real pleasant letter. I just want to be, I'll be upfront with you on that, but go ahead. You can continue.
I know it does not, sir. And I wrote that approximately 4 hours after I had gone and talked to Heather about the garbage, and it had only gotten worse as 4 hours had passed. But does my note show irritation? Absolutely. Any threat to anyone's safety or welfare? Not at all. I didn't use profanity other than an acronym for a profanity, and it was not the nicest note, but I have my office in the front of the house, which overlooks the garbage can. So I was watching this progress as I'm working all morning, and I just got upset and wrote the note. Now, as to what I'd like to present is the truth of what happened is in my evidence, and I request for this to be dismissed on the basis of the fact that there's never been any threat or any confrontation with this family and me. Each time, which I think it totals 3 that I've ever approached their house in the 18 months that I have lived here. And it's all in the 2 weeks about their garbage. It was to talk to her through her ring, to go leave the note later that day, and then 2 weeks later to go and ring the doorbell again to see if anybody was home, because the lid was open and stuff was blowing. I did have a cake liner. It looked like a piece of parchment paper from a birthday cake liner that was one of the things you see the picture of me holding that they insist wasn't theirs, but Mr. Unrath had just told my husband they had a birthday party there that weekend, and that's why there was a lot of garbage and tissue paper and stuff blowing around. But I didn't ever, I mean, the untruths and fabrications are very disturbing that Mr. Unrath is saying about me picking through other people's garbage. And he says something about I went to there's a little park across the street from both of our houses, and apparently there's a garbage can there. I've lived here 18 months. I've never stepped foot in that park. So he's perjuring himself with the lies about me. He's defaming me, saying I'm a commodity in the neighborhood, which he just said. I'm not even sure what that means, sir. But I've never posed any threat. I've minded my own business from these people the whole 18 months that I've lived here, and I did not like seeing their garbage strewn about. So I thought I tried to stop that from happening, and it's turned into this, unfortunately. In his testimony, and he seems to use very inflammatory language about me, saying I'm irate, aggressive, hateful, and confrontational, and irritated is what I was. Irritated is what I tried to get across. And you can see in my texts and in my note, I was irritated, but I was never hateful, aggressive, irate, or confrontational. So I want you to just consider that. The claims, you know, I'm not going to go through every little note that I've made here, but I just wanted to point out that I have felt intimidated and threatened by Mr. Unrath by ordering me. And I wish once again you had been able to listen to the audio, at least of the second incident that we had where my husband had gone outside. Under no circumstances did my husband know or wait and lie in wait for Mr. Unrath to arrive home on the second time that, or the last time we've had any contact with them. I have an office, as I said, in the front of my house. Our house walls are rather thin, and I can see activity going on very easily across next door to me and across the street. And I saw Mr. Unrath and said, go talk to him, hun, you know, see if you can straighten this out. And so that's when Kendall went out to speak to him that last time that we ever had any contact with them. And I did have a audio of that that Kendall had taken, and I wanted you to hear that also, but unfortunately did not. But I felt threatened by him that day. I did step out of my house when I heard hollering going on, and my husband never stepped on their property line, sir. I never stepped off of my front step that day. And Mr. Unrath instantly ordered me. His words are, get back in your house. And I'm a 57-year-old woman, and I really don't need anyone telling me to get back in my house. I felt intimidated by that, and I have felt intimidated by the text he sent me, especially an overtone of one statement in particular that really made me take it took me aback when he wrote to me, I'm serious, stay away from our home. And I'm like, that sounds very threatening. I mean, for a neighbor who have just gone over and said, you know, please, can you pick up your garbage? I'm starting to feel threatened by the things that he was saying to me. And I think my husband could even speak for how Mr. Unrath and he have had interactions that he kind of bullies my husband. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but I believe there was one conversation where Mr. Unrath told my husband that he was afraid to stand up to me. And I'm not sure why Mr. Unrath is taking this stance. And I would really like to just have nothing more to do with them. We are moving out of our house by the end of June of this year and leaving this neighborhood. And I want nothing to do with them now or in the future. Perfectly happy with them staying away from us and us staying away from them. If their garbage spills on my lawn, I will pick it up and throw it in my can without another word. But yeah, I do not need an order against me that is falsely accusing. And I feel that's what this is. It could hinder my ability in my job search right now. I'm a legal editor looking for employment right at the moment, and I don't need anything to hinder that search for me or my family's ability to find new housing in the next 3 months. So I request that this be dismissed, Your Honor.
There's an indication, I think I saw in there, and I could ask him to repeat it, that some, you know, garbage was placed, and again, he referenced Kirkland and Costco. Garbage was placed on their property with a rock over it, probably to keep it from being blown away.
You can see in my photographs, there's some of my evidence. There's a picture of.
Did that happen?
There, I did not plant anything. I walked out, I looked out my window and saw a big paper towel container, like 6-pack roll of paper towels. And it was stuck in my front bush. And I went out and took a picture of it. And then I picked it up and I walked to my property line with the Unraths and I set it down and put rocks from around an electrical box you can see in the photograph on top of it so it wouldn't blow away, because I got tired of picking up their garbage and putting it in my own can that day. And I never planted anything. I took one piece of garbage over to them that day and put it under their step. I held it up to the ring and said, I think, you know, your garbage is blowing around and I'm going to leave it here. And then hours later, that paper towel thing had blown into my bushes, and I was like, I'm not picking up their garbage anymore. And maybe that wasn't a neighborly thing to do, but when it's happening, this is the second, I think that was the second week, week that it happened. I just picked it up and I put some rocks from my yard on it. Never planted anything, never picked anything up out of anybody's can, assumed it was there since theirs was the only can on the street with the lid blown open. And in one of my other photographs from hours before, I think you clearly can see that exact same paper towel wrapper or something, blue plastic sticking out of their can that looks like it. I don't shop at Kirkland or whatever the store is that sells that. I've never shopped there. That's not my product. And he's accusing me of picking through people's garbage and putting it on his lawn. I don't need to do that at all. His garbage was blowing on my lawn.
Mr. Lindsay, anything you wish to say? I can swear you in and hear from you.
Yes, Your Honor.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear to affirm the information and testimony you provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, Your Honor.
You can put your hand down. What do you have to add?
Well, I feel that this is an egregious abuse of the legal system, that the Unraths are, imposing false allegations on my wife and myself. And this is causing us a lot of emotional distress because it has some serious ramifications on employment and housing. Our intention is to be leaving this neighborhood, as Jean said, at the end of June, and we have no desire or cause or need to have any interaction with the Unraths from this point going forward.
May I say something else? We never had
Hang
had
on,
it.
but he's not
Sorry.
quite done yet.
Oh, okay.
You can-
Yeah.
Yes, and so I think that this whole matter just needs to be dismissed, and I think it's an over-exaggeration, overblown situation that the order needs to be dismissed, and we need to go on about our lives. We have no intention to have any interaction with the owners.
So, did one of you call Mr. Unrath at work?
He and I exchanged cell numbers, and that was the only contact information that I had ever received from them. Back in probably October, November of 2021, when we first moved into them.
It's the 713 area code that we have, I
Ma'am,
believe. I
And
believe
so, hang on just a sec.
Sure.
So is that a yes? You
No.
called him on when he was at work?
I texted him.
I thought I heard
Work
Mr. Unrath
hours.
said he was called at work. That's what I thought I heard. If I'm
It
mistaken.
was during.
On his cell phone. Explain what phone.
It was
Okay, so
during.
Ms. Lindsay, yeah, he's fully qualified, I think, to speak for himself. So let's let him do that.
Yeah, I mean, it was during work hours, but it was on his mobile device, his mobile phone. I assume his mobile phone. That was the number that he had provided me. That was the only phone number that I had ever had for him.
And then there's also some testimony there that he spoke to you about it and just said he wanted all sort of interaction to go through you, and then that didn't happen. Is that accurate or no?
No.
And ma'am, I'm
Yes,
asking him.
Yes, sir.
yes, and yes, we had discussed that all interaction would go between he and I. And apparently there was a mistiming or something of me relaying that information when Jean had contacted him. And so.
So is what you're telling me then that you talked with Mr. and then you didn't, for whatever reason, relay that to Ms. Lindsay, and so she was unaware of the conversation that you and Mr. Unrath had had?
That's correct.
All right. Mr. Unrath, anything, or actually anything further from the Lindsays?
Yeah, I did want to say there was something very disturbing in the original papers that I had gotten, that Mr. Unrath, they're saying they feel threatened when I've never done or said anything to threaten them. And something that really stood out to me, that really bothered me, as he's in the service. I'm not involved in the military in any way, and I also do not possess or have any access to firearms, yet he made a statement in his testimony that I do. And that is incorrect and very assumption, like I don't know where, this sort of stuff is like out and out lies like that to take place. I just don't understand. I have no firearms. I have no access to, never have I ever in my life. And yet that is what I'm reading in these orders and things like that. I mean, I don't know how to take that, Your Honor. A lot of what he's said is fabricated, and that's all I can tell you is the truth.
Mr. Unrath, I'll come back to you. I'll give you the final word, and then I think I'm ready to rule.
Yes, Your Honor, I certainly appreciate it. So just in summary, all of the requests, all of the testimony, all of the petitioning that I've submitted, it's backed up by evidence by both mine and the respondents. And if you have not had an opportunity, and I certainly would encourage you to take a look at the video that the Lindsays have submitted, because I believe it's very in its entirety as to the folks that we're having to deal with. So that's all I really have to say in that regard, Your Honor. All we want to do is just be left alone and have some degree of peace of mind. And so that my children don't have to be fearful when they come home from school and cast furtive glances over into the Lindsay's driveway and ask me to move when I still have a year and some change left here at JBLM before we PCS. So that's all I would say, Your Honor. I certainly appreciate your time this morning.
How old are your kids?
12 and 8, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, so here's where I'm at. For better or for worse. I'm going to talk about the definition of harassment, which I haven't gotten yet. This is an anti-harassment petition. Unlawful harassment is a knowing and willful course of conduct directed at a specific person that seriously alarms, annoys, harasses, or is detrimental to such person and serves no legitimate or lawful purpose. Course of conduct must be such as would cause a reasonable person to suffer substantial emotional distress and must actually cause substantial emotional distress to the petitioner. A course of conduct is also filed, is also defined, excuse me, but I need to find it here. Is a pattern of conduct composed of a series of acts over a period of time, however short, evidencing a continuity of purpose. Course of conduct concludes any form of communication, contact, or conduct, including the sending of electronic communication, but does not include constitutionally protected free speech. In the testimony, again, I want to make some comments. First of all, with regard to the Lindsay's testimony, or some comments made by the Lindsays where, they term this as an overreaction on behalf of the Unrath to come to court and ask for this order. If there's any overreacting going on, in my view, it's what the Lindsays did in response to apparently an occasional or maybe even one-time event that happens probably in pretty much every neighborhood in the United States of America, where occasionally sometimes garbage is going to spill over, whether a dog gets into it, which happens, whether a seagull gets into it, which apparently happens here, or like I said before, whether a coyote gets into garbage or other sorts of animal, or sometimes the wind just blows things. That happens. And again, as I see it based on the evidence that's been presented to me, the Lindsay's reaction to that was a pretty big overreaction. Mr. Lindsay has indicated, well, he's not sure why the Unraths are taking this stance. Well, I am. It's because they don't want to have to, when something like this happens, again, the reaction and the tenor and tone of the reaction from Ms. Lindsay is, again, as I said, over the top and an overreaction. And I don't find Ms. Lindsay's indicate, well, they're trying to bully me and things like that. And it did not appear to me that that was the case either. But the question really is, whether or not an order should be entered here today or not. And, harassment, the normal things is people just, not every sort of conflict rises to the level of harassment. Sometimes people have arguments or something that it might be ongoing, but it all relates back to a single issue. But harassment in a typical or traditional, for lack of a better word, form of harassment. You know, if two people are in a relationship breaks up, one side can't handle it, and the other party won't leave the other person alone. Or like in the neighborhood context, you know, one neighbor is just constantly on the other neighbor for a variety of unrelated circumstances. And it looks to me like in this case, this evolves out of kind of a single instance about this garbage situation that suddenly and quickly got out of control. And so I don't find that the behavior of the Lindsays, however inappropriate, and clearly, ma'am, it was. There's no question about that. At this point, I don't find it rises to the level of harassment, so I'm not going to enter an order at this time, but I'll say this. Clearly, Mr. and Ms. Lindsley, and I'm talking to both of you, you know how the Unraths feel at this point and what this happened. Like I say, if there's any overreacting going on, it's coming from you folks, not from them. And just that's it. And so if there's any, both of you said, you know what, you just want to be left alone by the other person. And so I will tell the Unraths and I will tell you, if there is any sort of contact from them, and again, you perceive, oh, we were just trying to be nice, which is inconsistent with what I viewed in terms of the letter. Again, I admit I didn't see the video, but if there's any contact coming from the Lindsays to her Unrath going forward, I would consider harassing. And if that happens, Mr. and Ms. Unrath can refile, and then you'll get an order, and that hearing will be a heck of a lot shorter than this one. Do you understand where I'm coming from there, Mr. and Ms. Lindsay?
Do, Your Honor.
Okay, and that's what I'm going to do here for today. So I'm not going to enter an order, but again, I'll just let you folks know that if any sort of contact coming from the Lindsays to the Unrath, I would consider harassing in the future, and you can refile, and we'll reconsider it at that time. And that'll conclude the hearing here for today.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome. And that's it for